The mountain pass had been open to travel in the late season, a narrow road winding through cedar forests and past steep slopes where the rock showed its grey face through the moss, but on this particular afternoon the sky changed. It began with a shift in the colour of the light, a dimming that crept into the valley from the north, and then the first snowflakes started to drift down. Not many at first, but enough to make the air feel filled with a gentle motion, like the slow stirring of rice flour in water. The flakes fell with no wind to push them sideways, a vertical and unhurried descent that turned the treetops white, one branch at a time, covering the dark needles of the cedars with a thin, silent layer that thickened as the hour moved on. From the higher ground near the pass, the view stretched back down into the mountain basin, a place shaped like a bowl turned halfway on its side. And in that basin sat the village, but the falling snow was already softening its outlines, turning the thatched roofs into rows of faint, pale humps that blended with the whitening ground. The road that led up from the village to the pass followed a stream for most of its length, a stream that chattered over stones in summer, but now ran nearly mute beneath a fringe of ice at its edges, and the snow was beginning to fill the wagon ruts and the footprints left by woodcutters earlier in the week. A traveller standing at the highest bend, looking both back and forward, would have noticed that the world was losing its edges, that the pass itself was no longer a clear gap between peaks, but rather a deepening fog of snow, a place where the path dissolved and the landmarks vanished into a uniform grey-white that promised nothing but more snow to come. Soon the flakes grew smaller and closer together, a sign that the snow had settled into a purpose, and the pass began to seal itself with that steady accumulation that mountain winters always bring. It was not a dramatic event. There was no avalanche, no violent storm, only the methodical work of a snow that fell hour after hour, piling on the shoulders of the road, drifting quietly against the stone retaining walls, burying the low shrubs until only their tips remained like brushes dipped in whitewash. The cold deepened enough that the snow was dry, and each new flake joined its predecessors without melting, so the depth increased in increments that were almost imperceptible if you watched, but became obvious when you looked away and looked back. By late afternoon the pass was impassable, though no one tried it, because the village had long understood the rhythm of its winters and knew that once the snow began in this fashion, the mountain would keep its company to itself for weeks on end. Down in the village, the smell of wood smoke hung in the air and mixed with the falling snow in a way that made the cold feel inhabited rather than empty. The houses stood close together along a narrow main lane, with side paths branching off toward the kilns and workshops, and the roofs were steeply pitched so the snow would slide off in time, but for now it simply accumulated and rounded the edges of the eaves, making every building look softer and more patient than it did in summer. The workshops themselves were low structures of timber and clay, some with thatch and some with wooden shingles, and their chimneys sent up thin columns of smoke that frayed into the grey sky almost as soon as they cleared the rooftops. The snow absorbed the ordinary sounds of the village, the rattle of a wooden bucket, the distant call of a child, the scrape of a snow shovel on stone, and turned them all into muffled suggestions of activity that reached the ear as if from a great distance, though in truth the source was only a few steps away. Inside one of these workshops, the largest of the pottery sheds that stood at the edge of the village nearest the stream, the light was the pale grey of a winter afternoon, filtered through oiled paper screens. The floor was hard-packed earth, smoothed by years of bare feet and the dragging of clay-stained wooden boards, and it held the chill of the ground while the upper air near the rafters stayed slightly warmer from the breath of a small charcoal brazier that glowed in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, and on them rested rows of pots in various stages of drying, their colours ranging from the dark grey of wet clay to the lighter grey of leather hard pieces, with a few nearer the brazier showing the chalky pale tone of pots ready for the kiln. You were standing by one of these shelves, not doing anything in particular, just noticing how the silence had a different quality now than it had that morning, a deeper sort of quiet that seemed to press in from the outside, like the snow itself was leaning against the walls and asking the world to be still. The pots on the shelf were simple forms, tea bowls mostly, with a few small sake cups and an occasional larger water jar waiting for its glaze. Each had been placed upside down to dry evenly, and their foot rings caught the faint light as thin, pale circles that repeated down the length of the shelf in a quiet rhythm. You could see the throwing lines where the potter's fingers had pulled the clay upward, subtle horizontal ridges that recorded the speed of the wheel and the pressure of the hands in a single frozen moment. And the surface of each pot was smooth, but not perfectly so, bearing the slight irregularities that spoke of a human rhythm rather than a mechanical one. The damp smell of clay mixed with the faint tang of wood smoke from the brazier and the earthier scent of the trampled floor, and together they made a smell that was the smell of winter work, steady and unhurried and content to wait. From where you stood, you could look through the open doorway into the outer yard, though the door itself was slid only part-way open to keep the greatest cold at bay, and the view was a narrow slice of white and grey. The snow was falling past the gap with the same steady patience, piling up on the stepping stones that led to the workshop door, and the tracks left earlier by the potter's wooden clogs were already filling in and softening until they looked like the memory of footprints rather than footprints themselves. The bamboo water pipe that ran along the edge of the roof was silent now, frozen and glazed with a skin of ice, and the buckets beneath it sat empty with a dusting of snow on their rims. No birds called out in the trees beyond, no dogs barked from the village lane, and the only thing that moved was the snow itself, a slow and endless downward motion that seemed to have been going on since before you arrived and would continue long after you left. The light began to fail in the way it does on snowy afternoons, not with a dramatic sunset, but with a gradual leaching of colour that turned the grey a little darker and the white a little bluer, and inside the workshop the shapes of the shelves and the pots and the kick wheel against the back wall all grew less distinct as the shadows pooled into the corners. The charcoal in the brazier gave off a soft red glow that became more noticeable as the room darkened, a small warm centre in a space that was otherwise cooling toward the temperature of the outside air, and you could feel the cold creeping up through the soles of your feet from the earthen floor, a slow and gentle cold that was not unpleasant because you were dressed in padded winter clothes and still had the warmth of movement in you. The kick wheel stood silent with its stone flywheel half in shadow, the wooden seat pulled slightly askew, and a half-finished pot still resting on the wheel head under a damp cloth, a piece of work that had been interrupted by the changing weather and would wait patiently for the next day. There was no need to do anything more in the workshop now. The pots had been covered, the buckets of slip and blaze were sealed with wooden lids, the tools had been wiped and hung on their pegs, and the only sound was the occasional soft tick of the brazier as the charcoal settled or the faint whisper of snow sliding from the edge of the roof to land with a muffled puff on the pile below. You might have stood there a little longer, letting the stillness settle into your own breathing, noticing that your breath made no visible cloud because the air inside was not quite cold enough for that. Or you might have simply turned and reached for your straw snow cloak hanging by the door, the one that was stiff with cold and slightly damp at the hem from an earlier outing, and begun the slow process of preparing to step back outside. The walk home through the village was a matter of a few hundred paces, but in the snow it felt both shorter and longer. Shorter because the familiar landmarks were so softened that you passed them without quite recognizing the usual gate or the usual woodpile, and longer because each step had to be taken with care through the deepening powder that now reached above the ankle and was still falling. The village lane had been shoveled once in the morning and then again at midday, but the fresh accumulation had already erased those efforts and left only a shallow depression to mark where the path had been, a slight curve of lower snow between the higher banks that lined the edges. The snow muffled your footsteps, the wooden sandals pressing down with a soft crunch, and then lifting with a whisper, and the sound of your own breath was the loudest thing in your ears, a gentle rise and fall that matched the rhythm of your walking. The houses on either side wore their winter roofed steeply, the thatch so thickly covered that it looked like the icing on a confection, and here and there a yellow glow of lamplight slipped through a crack in a shutter or a gap in a door, telling that someone was still awake inside, perhaps drinking a last cup of tea or mending a tool by the fire. The snow had stopped falling as heavily as before, or perhaps it only seemed so because you were now inside it rather than watching it from a window, and the flakes came more sparsely now, large and lazy and rocking side to side as they descended, each one taking its time to find its place. The path led past the small Shinto shrine at the edge of the village, its torii gate now a white bracket against the dark trees, and past the communal well whose rope and bucket were frozen into a single lump of ice, and then turned slightly uphill toward the cluster of homes where the potter and his family lived. Your own house came into view as a low, dark shape beneath a white roof, with the entrance set back and a bamboo fence half buried in a drift that had formed along the northern exposure. You slid open the wooden door, stepping up into the jenkan where you knocked the snow from your sandals and hung the damp cloak on its peg. The fire was already beginning to stiffen in the cold air of the entryway. Inside, the main room was lit by a single oil lamp whose flame burned steady and yellow behind a paper shade, and the light fell on the tatami mats, on the low table with its tea things still laid out, on the alcove where a simple scroll hung with a winter landscape, and on the thick futons that were already spread and waiting, the bedding puffed and white like a smaller version of the snow outside. You knelt on the tatami for a moment, letting the warmth of the house seep through your clothes, listening to the near silence that was not quite silence because it held the soft hiss of charcoal in the hearth and the distant creak of a beam adjusting to the cold. The snow had stopped falling altogether now, and the world outside was so still that you could almost hear the frost forming on the grass beneath the snow, a crystalline growing that made no sound at all. The village, the pass, the workshop, the pots on their shelves, all of it was wrapped in a quiet that would hold until morning, and the only thing left to do was to lie down and let the night take you, the way the winter takes the mountain, gently and without any need for hurry. The lamp was blown out with a soft breath, and the darkness closed in, and the long night settled over the snowbound valley like a blanket drawn up to the chin of the earth. You woke in the deep winter dark, the kind of dark that fills a room like water fills a pool, without edges and without any source of light except the faintest grey suggestion of the paper screen that faced the outer door. The house was cold, but not bitterly so, because the thick thatch above and the wooden walls around held the night's chill at a distance, and the futon under which you slept was heavy with the weight of several cotton layers, each one trapping a pocket of warmth that your body had made during the night. For a moment you did not move, simply lay on the tatami and listened to the quality of the silence, a silence that had the particular density of deep snow pressing down on the village and absorbing every sound that might try to rise, and you knew without looking that the snow had continued through the night and that the world outside was still and white and waiting. The first movement was the slow folding back of the futon's edge, letting the colder air touch your shoulder, and then your arm as you sat up, and the wooden frame of the sleeping alcove creaked once under the shift of weight before settling again into stillness. Your feet found the slippers laid beside the futon, straw slippers with cloth soles that made a soft whisking sound on the tatami, and you crossed the room toward the sunken hearth in its center, the aerie that held the banked embers from the night before. Kneeling beside it, you lifted the wooden lid that covered the ash, using a small iron hook, and the faint orange glow of the remaining charcoal breathed into view, a tiny constellation of warmth in the darkness that was just enough to show the shape of the kettle hanging from its adjustable hook above. The fire needed coaxing, and you did this without haste, reaching for the kindling basket where thin strips of pine wood and dried cedar bark were kept, laying them across the embers in a loose grid, then bending to blow gently at the base where the faintest sparks still lived. The breath was steady and slow, a rhythm that matched the rise and fall of your own chest, and after a few moments, a small flame caught the edge of the bark and grew into the kindling, casting a warm yellow light that pushed the shadows back toward the corners. The kettle, a heavy iron pot with a rough surface and a wooden lid, began to tick as the metal expanded, and you filled it with water from the earthenware jar that stood on the floor nearby, the water cold enough to make your fingers ache for a moment before the fire's warmth returned. While the water heated, you prepared the morning meal, a simple routine that occupied the hands and let the mind remain quiet, moving through the small kitchen area where a wooden cutting board and a shelf of bowls and a ceramic container of miso paste waited in the dim light. The rice was already cooked from the previous evening, stored in the wooden tub, wrapped in a thick cloth to keep it warm, and you scooped a portion into a small bowl, the grains clinging together in a soft white mass that steamed when you handled them, carrying the mild sweet scent of short-grain rice that had been grown in the terraced paddies lower down the mountain during the warmer months. The miso soup came together in a second bowl, a spoonful of the dark fermented paste dissolved into hot water from the now simmering kettle, stirred slowly with chopsticks until the liquid turned a cloudy beige and the smell of soy and barley and long slow fermentation filled the air around you, mixing with the wood smoke and the faint cold draft that came from under the door. You ate sitting on the tatami near the fire, the bowl of rice warm in your left hand and the chopsticks moving in your right. Each bite a small and unhurried event that you did not rush because there was no reason to rush. The day ahead holding only the same quiet work that every winter day held, and the snow outside ensuring that nothing would interrupt the rhythm. The miso soup was salty and rich, with a few small cubes of soft tofu that had been made in the village the day before the pass closed, and a scattering of dried seaweed that plumped in the hot liquid. And you drank it slowly, setting the bowl down between sips to watch the fire flicker against the underside of the kettle. The room by now had warmed enough that you no longer saw your breath, that the chill still clung to the walls and to the far corners where the light did not reach, and the contrast between the warm center near the hearth and the cold perimeter was something you had known every winter morning of your life, and therefore did not notice except as a familiar sensation in the background of things. After the meal, you washed the bowls in a wooden basin of cold water, scrubbing them with a cloth made of twisted straw, and set them upside down on a bamboo rack to dry, each one tilted at the same angle as the others so that the water would drip away completely. The routine then turned to dressing, a process made longer by the winter layers that were necessary to spend any time outdoors, beginning with a thin inner robe of cotton that had been warmed by the fire and moving outward through thicker padded garments, the sleeves wider at the wrist to allow movement and the waist tied with a simple cord. Over everything went a short jacket lined with coarse wool, and then the leggings that wrapped the lower legs, the fingers moving through the tying of knots and the adjusting of folds with the ease of long practice, not needing to think about what came next, because the body remembered on its own. Last were the tubby socks, split-toed and padded, pulled on and tucked under the leggings, and then the straw sandals that waited in the genkan, their cords stiff with cold and slightly damp from the previous day's snow. You stepped into the entryway and slid the wooden outer door aside, and the morning opened before you in a color that was not yet day, but was no longer full night, a blue-gray tone that came from the snow reflecting the faint light of a sky still waiting for dawn. The snow had indeed continued through the night, not heavily but steadily enough to add several inches to what had already fallen the day before, and every surface that had been cleared was covered anew, the shoveled path now only a slight depression, the stone lantern by the gate a white mound with a dark tip, the bamboo fence barely visible as a series of horizontal ripples in the fresh powder. The air was still and so cold that it seemed to have a texture, a clean sharpness that entered the nose and woke the lungs, and the snow that had piled on the roof's edge overhung like a thick white eave, ready to drop when the day warmed it, just enough. You took the snow shovel from where it leaned beside the door, a simple wooden blade with a long handle worn smooth by many winters, and began to clear the path from the house to the lane, the motion a repeating cycle of push, lift, toss, push, lift, toss, push, lift, toss that settled into the same unhurried pace as the wedging of clay or the kicking of the wheel. The snow was dry and light, easy to move, and it flew from the shovel in soft arcs that scattered and drifted down like the flakes themselves, landing on the growing banks on either side that had already reached waist height and would likely reach shoulder height before the winter's end. As you worked, you could see the village beginning to stir in small ways, a shutter sliding open here, a column of smoke thickening there, the dark shape of a neighbor moving slowly across a snowy yard just as you were moving, each person tending to their own small clearing without any need for words, because the shoveling was a shared language spoken in the rhythm of wood against snow. The path cleared enough for walking, you leaned the shovel against the house and set out toward the workshop, following the lane that curved gently around the village's central well. Your wooden sandals left a trail of crisp prints in the fresh snow that remained on the path, prints that were the first of the morning, and that would be joined soon by others, the potter's assistant perhaps, or the kiln stoker, each set of tracks weaving briefly together before diverging again to their own workshops and sheds. The village was built close, the houses nearly touching in some places, and the spaces between them were narrow passages that funneled the cold air down from the mountain. But the buildings themselves blocked the wind and made the lane feel sheltered, a corridor of wood and thatch and snow that led past the silent fronts of homes whose residents were still inside, kneeling by their own fires, drinking their own tea, preparing for their own winter days. Passing the kilns, you noticed the warmth before you saw the smoke. A subtle shift in the air temperature that told you the fireboxes had been lit during the night to keep the climbing kiln at a low, steady heat for a pre-firing or a drying cycle, and the smell of burning pine filled the space between the kiln shed and the next building, a resinous scent that clung to the cold air and reminded you of the work ahead. The kiln itself was a long slope built into the hillside, its chimneys barely visible against the grey sky, and the snow on its roof had melted in patches where the heat from within rose through the clay tiles, creating dark geometric shapes that stood out against the white, like the patterns on a raked sand garden. A single figure moved near the firebox, bent over the woodpile, and a thin spiral of fresh smoke rose from the stokehole as another log was fed in, the orange light flaring briefly before settling back into its steady glow. You did not stop at the kiln but continued past it to the workshop that belonged to your family, the low building with its thatched roof and its door facing south, to catch the winter light when the sun decided to show itself through the clouds. The snow had drifted against the door, and you pulled it open with a firm tug that dislodged a small avalanche of powder from the lintel, the snow falling straight down like a curtain and landing on the doorstep with a soft puff. Inside, the workshop was colder than the house had been, the air thick with the smell of damp clay and wood ash and the faint metallic tang of the iron tools that hung on the wall, and the darkness was almost complete except for the grey rectangles of the paper windows that let in the earliest light of the morning, a light that was still too weak to show colours and rendered everything in shades of charcoal and slate. You moved through the familiar space by memory as much as by sight, stepping around the low table where finished pots sat waiting for transport to the kiln, ducking slightly under the beam where the drying line hung with cloths that had stiffened overnight into frozen shapes, until you reached the brazier in the corner. The charcoal from the day before was cold, of course, and you emptied the ash pan into the bucket that served for that purpose, then laid fresh charcoal in a careful pyramid over a bed of dried rice husks that would catch the flame easily, lighting it with a spill from the lantern that you had brought from the house and had set on the shelf by the door. The husks flared briefly. The charcoal began to crackle, and the brazier came to life with its own small voice, a soft rushing sound that filled the silence and began to push back the cold from the immediate circle of air around it. With the warmth beginning to spread, you did the morning inspection of the workshop, a slow walk around the perimeter that checked the state of the drying pots, the tightness of the slip bucket lids, the cleanliness of the wire-cutting tool and the sponge, and the readiness of the kickwheel for another day's work. The pots on the shelves were drier than yesterday, their surfaces now a uniform pale grey that meant they were approaching the leather-hard stage, and you tapped one gently with a fingernail, listening to the faint ringing tone that answered, a tone that said it was time to trim them soon, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after. The slip bucket, when you lifted its lid, had formed a skin on the surface, a thin, rubbery layer of partially dried clay liquid that you peeled away and discarded, and the slip beneath was creamy and smooth, its consistency perfect after the stirring you would give it later when the time came to dip new pots. The sponge was stiff with cold, so you poured a little warm water from the kettle that now sat on the brazier into a shallow dish and placed the sponge inside, watching it soften and swell as it absorbed the moisture, its pores opening like a dried riverbed, receiving the first rain of the season. The tools on the wall hung from their pegs in the same order they always did. The wooden ribs in a row by size, the loop tools with their wire edges, the needle tool for cutting pots from the wheel head, the bamboo trimming chisels, and the flat metal scraper for cleaning the wheel and the work table. You took down the bucket of throwing water and set it beside the wheel, filling it from the larger water jar that stood near the door, the water making a hollow glugging sound as it poured and then settling into stillness. The wheel itself needed a check, and you crouched beside it to spin the flywheel by hand, listening to the shaft turning in its socket, a smooth and oiled sound that spoke of proper maintenance, the stone flywheel humming slightly as it gained speed and then slowing again, its weight keeping the momentum longer than an ordinary wheel would, which made it ideal for long sessions of throwing that required a steady and uninterrupted rhythm. The cloth that had covered the half-finished pot on the wheel head was dry now, and you peeled it back to check the moisture of the clay beneath, pressing a fingertip against the rim and feeling the slight, Give that meant it was still soft enough to work, but stiff enough to hold its shape. A perfect state for the next stage of pulling the walls thinner and higher. You decided that the pot could wait a little longer, that the morning was for wedging fresh clay and beginning new pieces, because the routine of pottery was a cycle of many stages running simultaneously, some pots being thrown while others dried and others trimmed, and others waited for the kiln. A slow, overlapping rhythm that filled every day without ever feeling rushed. You replaced the damp cloth over the half-finished piece, tucking it around the base to keep the clay from drying unevenly, and then you turned toward the clay storage bins that sat along the back wall, their wooden lids heavy and their contents smelling of earth and time. The clay had been dug from the hillside above the village the previous autumn, weathered in the open air through the winter of last year, then soaked and sieved and dried on wooden boards until it reached a workable consistency, and now it sat in a large block, wrapped in damp cloths and covered with a wooden lid that you lifted with both hands, setting it aside. The clay was dark grey and slightly cold to the touch, with a smooth, uniform texture of a material that had been prepared with care, free of air bubbles and stones and other impurities that would ruin a pot on the wheel. You cut a wedge from the block using the wire cutter, pulling the thin wire through the clay with a sawing motion that made a wet, tearing sound, and the wedge came away cleanly, its cut surface glistening and showing the fine grain of the material, layer upon layer of tiny flat particles aligned by the wire's passage. This wedge would become several bowls, perhaps 4 or 5 depending on how you chose to portion it, and you carried it to the wedging table that stood near the wheel, a heavy wooden slab, worn concave by generations of potters who had kneaded their clay in exactly this spot. The wedging table had a dusting of dry clay powder on its surface to prevent sticking, and you scattered a fresh handful from the powder jar before setting the clay down and beginning the slow rhythm of wedging, a process that would occupy your hands for the next while and would be the subject of its own careful attention. Outside, the morning had moved from blue-grey to pale silver as the sun rose somewhere behind the clouds, its light still too diffuse to cast shadows, but bright enough to make the paper windows glow with a soft uniform whiteness, and the snow continued to fall in a thin, sparse pattern, less a storm now than a gentle afterthought, the tiny flakes drifting down almost hesitantly, as if they were not sure whether to land or simply dissolve back into the air. The village had fully woken by now, the lane bearing several sets of footprints that crossed and recrossed each other, and the chimneys all spoke their thin lines of smoke into the sky, the potter's morning settling into its familiar shape, like clay settling into the center of a spinning wheel. The wedging took the time it always took, a span measured not in minutes but in the changing texture of the clay under your hands, the way the cool, dense lump became first a bit warmer and then a bit softer, the way the resistance against your palms diminished as the air pockets were squeezed out and the particles aligned, the way the faint marbling of lighter and darker grey streaks disappeared until the clay was one uniform color and one uniform temper, smooth as smoothed could be and ready to be thrown. You shaped the finished clay into a few squat cones, each one sized for a medium tea bowl, and set them on a damp wooden board near the wheel, covering them with a wrung-out cloth that clung to their tops and draped over their sides to keep the surfaces from forming a skin while you prepared the wheel itself. Then you rinsed your hands in the bucket of throwing water, the water turning milky as the clay dissolved from your skin, and wiped them on the apron that hung from a peg, the fabric stiff with old clay and dark with moisture at the hem. Before sitting down to the wheel, you checked the main clay storage bin once more, lifting the heavy lid and peering inside of the large remaining block that would supply many more days of work before it was exhausted. You pressed a dry finger into the surface and felt the slight cool give of well-kept clay, the texture neither sticky nor crumbly, but exactly between those two states, holding the impression of your fingertip without cracking, and you judged that it needed no extra water today, though you made a mental note to sprinkle a cupful over the top and recover it tightly tomorrow if the brazier had dried the workshop air too much by evening. The lid went back on with a soft, solid thud that echoed once against the back wall, and then was swallowed by the quiet. You walked over to the kick wheel, which stood in its own corner, where the earthen floor had been worn into a shallow depression from the countless hours of sitting and kicking and leaning forward, a human-shaped hollow that told the story of the work as plainly as any written record. The wheelhead, A disc of dark, close-grained wood about the size of a large dinner plate was lightly dusted with dry clay powder from the previous day's throwing, and you took a clean cloth from the shelf beside you and wiped it in slow circles, removing every grain of grit until the wood gleamed with a low, oiled sheen. The surface as smooth as a river stone, and just as cool to the touch. Around the base of the wheel head, the wheel pan was already clean. A wide basin of the same dark wood that caught the water and the slip and the trimmings, and you checked that its drain hole was clear, poking a thin bamboo splinter through to make sure no dried clay was blocking it. Then you sat down, lowering yourself onto the low wooden seat that was built as part of the wheel frame. A seat that had been shaped over the years by the weight of the potters who had used it before you. Its front edge beveled to cradle the backs of the thighs, and its surface polished to a deep brown by the constant friction of rough work trousers. The seat was fixed at the right height, so that your knees, when you placed your feet on the ground, would be slightly higher than your hips, a position that gave you leverage for the kicking motion, and you settled into it now, shifting your weight until you found the spot that felt like the center of balance, the place from which you could lean forward and reach the wheel head without straining your back. The floor beneath your right foot held the wooden footrest of the kick mechanism, a Y pedal worn into a shallow curve that matched the arch of a foot, and you rested your bare foot there lightly, feeling the familiar shape. The way the wood was a little warmer than the air because it had been protected from the coldest drafts by the wheel frame itself. The structure of the kick wheel was a thing worth understanding slowly, because it was the heart of the workshop and its design was the accumulation of many generations of patient refinement, each part fitted to the next in a way that made the whole assembly move as one thing when it was in use. At the top, the wheel head was fixed to a vertical shaft of hardwood about the thickness of a man's wrist that passed down through a hole in the wooden bench and continued toward the floor, held straight by a collar of oiled leather that was packed into a socket beneath the seat. Further down, the shaft connected to the heavy flywheel, a large stone disc nearly 2 handspans in diameter, and as thick as your thumb is long, its edge rough and its face is ground flat, with a square hole chiseled through its center where the square section of the shaft fit tightly and turned with it. The stone flywheel rested in a cradle of greased wood that allowed it to spin freely but kept it perfectly horizontal, and the sheer weight of the stone gave the wheel its most important quality, the momentum that would keep it turning long after you stopped kicking, so that the pot could be thrown in a continuous, fluid motion without the speed wobbling or dying away at the critical moment. Beneath the stone, the shaft continued down into a simple socket of hardened clay that sat in a hole in the floor, a bearing that was lubricated every morning with a few drops of water, and that made a soft, low sound when the wheel turned, a rushing whisper like wind through dry grass. The footrest was connected to the shaft by a wooden crank, an offset peg that converted the back-and-forth kick of your foot into the rotary motion of the shaft and the flywheel, and the whole linkage was held together by pegs that could be tightened or loosened with a small mallet if the mechanism ever developed to wobble, though it rarely did, so well was it made. Overhead, a simple wooden frame held a few favored tools within easy reach, and beside the seat a small shelf carried the bucket of throwing water, the sponge, and the needle tool, all arranged in the same order every time, so that your hand could find them without looking. You placed your right foot on the footrest and gave an experimental push, a slow and gentle kick that moved the pedal forward, and the crank turned, the shaft rotated, and the flywheel began to stir from its rest, the whole assembly waking up with a soft, low hum that rose in pitch as the speed increased. The wheel head spun through its first few revolutions, the light from the paper window sliding across its polished surface in a slow, sweeping pattern that made the faint grain of the wood visible as a series of concentric rings that seemed to ripple outward from the center. You drew your foot back and pushed again, another easy kick that added to the momentum, and now the flywheel was turning briskly, its heavy mass storing the energy of your muscle and releasing it in a smooth, uninterrupted rotation that filled the quiet air with a steady, reassuring sound, a sound that was not quite a whir and not quite a hum, but something in between, the voice of a well-made machine that asked for nothing more than to be kept in motion by the patient rhythm of a human foot. You let the wheel spin for a while without doing anything else, simply feeling the movement travel up through the frame and into the seat where you sat, a faint vibration that was more a presence than a physical shake, and you listened to the layers of sound that made up the wheel's voice, the low thrum of the stone flywheel, the higher whisper of the shaft in its leather collar, the soft tick of the wooden crank at the bottom of each stroke, all of them merging into a single steady note that filled the workshop and pushed back the silence of the snow outside. The wheelhead was a blur of motion now, its edges disappearing into a transparent disc that seemed to be both still and moving at the same time, and you reached out a hand and let one fingertip rest ever so lightly on the spinning wood, feeling the absolute smoothness of the surface as it slid beneath your skin. A sensation that told you the wheel was perfectly balanced and perfectly centered, ready for the clay. After a minute or two, you stopped kicking and let the momentum run down naturally, the flywheel giving up its stored energy in a long, gradual deceleration that was as even as its acceleration had been, the hum dropping in pitch, the wheel head returning from a blur to a shape with visible edges, and finally the assembly came to rest with the crank just forward of its lowest position, a random stopping point that it would reach differently every time. You sat there in the quiet that followed, the contrast between the spinning and the stillness making the workshop feel especially calm. And the only sounds now were the soft crackle of the charcoal in the brazier and the occasional distant thump of snow sliding from a roof somewhere in the village. The damp cloths covering the clay cones beside you had settled more closely onto their shapes, and you adjusted it slightly before placing your foot on the pedal once more, ready to begin the slow work of centering the first lump of clay, a process that would unfold in its own time and in its own rhythm, as every process in this winter-bound workshop had unfolded and would continue to unfold until the past reopened and the seasons changed again. You returned to the wedging table, the same heavy slab of wood that stood a few steps from the wheel, its surface worn to a shallow, smooth hollow from years of clay being pressed and folded upon it, and you lifted the damp cloth that covered the remaining lump of prepared clay, the larger mass from which you had already taken one wedge earlier. The clay block was still moist, its top glistening slightly in the light from the brazier, and you ran the flat of your hand over it to feel the even coolness, testing for any spots that had begun to dry or form a crust. But the cloth had done its work well, and the surface was as fresh as when you had first uncovered it. You took the wire cutter from its hook on the side of the table, a simple length of thin wire strung between two small wooden handles worn dark with clay-stained sweat, and you held it taut between your hands, lowering it onto the far edge of the block and pulling it toward yourself in a smooth, level pass, the wire slicing through the dense material with a faint wet whisper, a sound that was half hiss and half sigh, and a new wedge of clay separated from the main block and flopped gently onto the table, its cut face shining and the wedge was irregular in shape, a rough slab about the size of both your hands placed side by side, and you picked it up and set it in the middle of the wedging hollow, then scattered a little dry clay dust over the wood around it to prevent sticking, the dust pale and soft as milled flour. You placed the wire cutter aside and stood facing the table squarely, your feet set a comfortable distance apart on the earthen floor, your weight balanced, your shoulders relaxed, because the wedging motion would go on for a long while, and it was important to begin it in a posture that would not tire the body, a posture that let the work flow from the center of your body outward, through your arms and into the clay. Wedging was a process of removing air, evening the moisture, and aligning the particles of clay so that it would behave predictably on the wheel, strong and uniform in every direction. And the typical method in this workshop was a technique handed down through the potters of the village, a spiral wedging that worked the clay into a tight, homogeneous mass without trapping new air in the folds. The first motion was simple and direct. You placed both hands on the mass, the heels of your palms pressing into the top of the clay while your fingers curled around the sides, and you pushed firmly forward and downward at a slight angle, spreading the lump against the table in a rolling compression that made the clay flatten and elongate into a shape like a thick tongue, its leading edge curling forward and its rear edge lifting slightly as your weight moved through it. The sound was a soft, wet, squelching exhalation, the sound of clay being forced against wood and of tiny hidden air pockets collapsing as the material surrendered its secrets. Without pausing, you pulled the mass back toward yourself, folding the leading edge over onto the body of the clay in a motion that trapped no new air because the fold was made gently and at an angle. The clay settling onto itself like a wave returning to the shore, and as you brought it back you also rotated the lump a quarter turn. A subtle shift of the hands that repositioned it for the next push. Then you pushed again, a second cycle that felt different from the first because the clay had already begun to warm and soften under the friction of your palms and the repeated compression, and the sound this time was slightly wetter and quieter, a soft, thick pressing noise rather than a squelch, the material becoming more cohesive with every movement. You settled into the rhythm and let the mind grow still, the body alone knowing what to do, the hands continuing their steady work as the shapes and textures shifted by slow degrees. The wedging went on, not in a strict count, but in a continuous flow that you could measure by the way the clay changed under your touch, the surface becoming smoother and the color more uniform, the streaks and folds that had been visible at the start gradually blending together until the lump had the appearance of a single solid substance, a dark grey material with a fine, almost creamy gloss where your hands had burnished it. Each push added a little more warmth from your skin to the clay, and each fold brought a little more order to the internal structure, the flat microscopic platelets that made up the clay body sliding over one another and aligning in the direction of the spiral, a hidden architecture that would give the finished pot its strength, allowing the walls to be pulled thinner without cracking or warping in the fire. You could feel this alignment happening under your hands as a subtle change in the way the clay responded, the resistance becoming more even and predictable, the lump moving less like a collection of soft chunks and more like a single thing with a will of its own that was learning to trust your guidance. The sounds of wedging were always soft, but they varied as the work progressed, beginning with the sharper, wetter noises of freshly cut clay that still held trapped air and irregular moisture, and gradually subsiding into the deeper, more muffled sound of clay that was nearly ready, a sound like the gentle clapping of damp earth, each push a low, rhythmic bump, followed by a faint sliding hiss as your hands smoothed across the top. You listened to these sounds without paying attention to them, letting them become part of the larger quiet of the workshop, a quiet that was filled also with the distant breathing of the charcoal brazier, the occasional creak of the roof beam, and the all-surrounding silence of the snow that lay deep on the village and the mountain pass, a silence that had a presence of its own and that seemed to wrap around every small noise and hold it gently, like a hand cupped around a candle flame in a draughty room. The clay reached its intermediate state, a point at which it was fully mixed and free of air, but still not quite fully aligned, and you paused for a moment to rest your hands, lifting them from the clay and shaking them lightly to loosen the fingers, and you looked at the lump sitting on the table, now a neat, rounded dome with a smooth surface that glistened along the high points where your palms had pressed most firmly. The color had deepened from the pale, mottled gray of the freshly cut wedge to a richer, more even tone, something like the color of a rain cloud at dusk, and the surface was now so free of texture that it reflected the dim light of the workshop as a faint, soft sheen, a sign that the particles had begun to align and that the clay was entering its final stage of preparation. You took up the wire cutter again and sliced the dome in half with one clean pull, checking the cut surfaces for any hidden air pockets or dry spots, and the two halves fell apart to reveal interiors that were as smooth and uniform as the outside, with no bubbles, no marbling, no flaws of any kind, just the fine, even grain of properly wedged clay. Satisfied, you put the two halves back together, pressing them firmly along the join, and you resumed the spiral wedging one more time to erase the cut, and to bring the clay to a final state of readiness. The last series of pushes and folds and turns feeling almost effortless now, because the clay was so cooperative, so willing to be shaped. The final lump was a compact rounded mass that held its form without slumping, its texture firm but pliable, each push of your finger leaving a clean impression that stayed until you smoothed it away, and you knew by the weight and the coolness and the slight springy give under pressure that it was ready, perfectly ready, for the wheel. Now came the division into smaller portions, and you reached for a bamboo knife, a thin strip of bamboo with one edge sharpened to a blunt blade that could cut clay without catching or dragging. You sliced the lump into 3 equal pieces, then each piece into 2 more, and then from 2 of those you cut smaller amounts, estimating by eye and by the feel of the weight in your hand the sizes needed for tea bowls and for small cups, because the day's work would require several pieces of different types. Once the portions were separated, you took each one in your hands and shaped it into a rough cone, not the neat pointed cone that some potters favored, but a slightly rounded cone with a flat bottom and a smooth domed top, a shape that would sit well on the wheel head and would center easily when the time came, its base matching the area where the clay would first make contact with the spinning wood. The shaping of each cone was itself a small act of quiet attention that required nothing more than measuring the clay between your cupped hands and rotating it slowly, compressing here and smoothing there, brushing away any tiny crumbs that clung to the surface and setting it down near the wheel with the base pressed flat against the damp wooden board. With the third cone, the fourth cone, the fifth, the rhythm repeated without variation, each one taking shape in the same unhurried way, the hands moving in small, precise gestures that might have looked idle to anyone watching, but that were in fact the accumulated habit of many years. The body's memory of what a good cone should feel like when it was ready to be thrown. When all the portions had been shaped, you stood a little longer at the wedging table, letting the quiet surround you, looking at the row of grey cones standing on the damp board like a cluster of small mountains waiting for their turn under your fingers. The damp cloth that would cover them was already within reach, a square of heavy cotton that had been soaked in water and wrung out so that it was moist, but not dripping, and you draped it over the cones carefully, tucking it in around the bases so that no air could reach the clay and start a skin forming, the cloth conforming to the shapes beneath it and darkening where it touched the moist surfaces. The table was now clean except for a few crumbs of dry clay that you brushed into a small pile with the side of your hand and then swept into the scrap bucket, a bucket that would later be emptied into the slip mixing tub where dry trimmings and scraps were recombined with water to make slurry for glazing or for joining handles, because nothing was wasted in the pottery workshop, nothing was thrown away, everything returned to the cycle in one form or another. Your hands, when you finally rested them on the edge of the table, were coated in a thin film of clay that was already drying to a pale grey crust in the lines of your knuckles and around your nails, and you went to the water bucket and rinsed them, dipping them into the cool water and rubbing them together slowly, watching the clay dissolve and cloud the water like milk poured into tea, the particles swirling and settling and leaving your skin pink from the cold and the friction. You dried them on the apron, the fabric rough against the now clean skin, and you stood for a moment looking out through the narrow gap of the workshop door into the white world beyond, where the snow continued its gentle, thoughtless fall, each flake a tiny point of motion in the stillness, and the village lay wrapped in its winter quiet, as if the whole place had been put away in a storehouse for the season, waiting for the past to open and the world to return. The brazier was burning low, so you added a few fresh pieces of charcoal from the basket, placing them carefully with the iron tongs so they settled into the glowing bed without smothering it, and you adjusted the damper on the small air hole at the base of the brazier to let in a little more draught, watching the embers brighten and the new charcoal catch and begin to crackle, thin blue flames dancing across its surface. The warmth spread outward in a slow wave, reaching you where you stood, and you felt it on your face and on your hands, a gentle reminder that the workshop was a refuge, a small pocket of human stillness in the vast white quiet of the mountain winter. The kick-wheel waited in its corner with the patience of a sleeping animal, the stone flywheel catching a reflection of the firelight as a faint orange curve on its dark edge, and the wrapped cones of clay sat ready under their damp cloth, each one holding within it the potential of a bowl or a cup, a form that did not yet exist, but that would emerge from the spinning clay when the time was right. You knew that the next step would be to sit down again at the wheel, to place one of those cones on the wheel head, to wet your hands, and to begin the slow work of centering, the process of coaxing the clay into perfect balance on the spinning axis, a process that was itself a kind of meditation, and that would fill the next hour or more with its own quiet rhythm. But for now, you allowed yourself a moment of stillness, standing beside the table with your hands clean and your breath slow and your mind as empty as the sky, the wedging done, the clay ready, the winter day moving along its unhurried path toward the afternoon, and the snow falling on the mountain pass that would not open again for many weeks, isolating the potter and the village and the worksap and the work, and the rest and the quiet acceptance of the seasons long, slow turning. You sat down on the low wooden seat before the kick wheel, settling your weight into the hollow that years of use had carved into the surface, and you placed your bare right foot on the footrest, feeling the smooth curve of the wood against the arch, the familiar angle that translated the push of your leg into the turning of the shaft far below. The damp cloth still covered the row of clay cones on the board beside you, and you reached over and lifted one corner, peeling it back carefully so as not to disturb the shapes beneath. Then chose the nearest cone, the one that felt slightly cool and heavy when you picked it up, its base flat and its top rounded and its whole form fitting neatly into the cup of your palm. You transferred it to the wheel head, setting it down as close to the center as your eye could judge, pressing it firmly so that it stuck to the wood, and then you adjusted its position by eye, nudging it a finger's width to the left, then back a little, until it sat in what looked like the middle of the spinning disc, though you knew the true center was something the clay would have to find for itself under the pressure of your hands, not something you could place by sight alone. Before you began to kick, you leaned to the side and dipped your right hand into the bucket of throwing water, scooping up a palmful and letting it dribble over the clay cone, the water beading and running down the grey surface in quick rivulets that darkened the clay where they passed and made it shine for a moment before soaking in, and then you dipped your left hand too, wetting both hands thoroughly and shaking off the excess drops back into the bucket with a soft patter. The water was cool but not cold, its temperature moderated by the brazier that glowed a few feet away, and it felt clean and light on your skin, a thin layer of slickness that would reduce friction between your hands and the spinning clay once the wheel was in motion. You cupped a little extra water in your right palm and held it ready, the way a painter holds a reserve of color on the brush, and then you set your foot to the pedal and gave the first kick. The kick was slow and measured, just enough to start the flywheel stirring from its rest, and the shaft turned, the crank rotated, and the wheel head began to spin with a low, steady hum that filled the silence of the workshop, a sound that was already as familiar as your own breathing, the deep note of the stone flywheel blending with the higher whisper of the leather collar and the soft creak of the wooden frame. You kicked again, building the speed gradually, and the clay cone on the wheel head became a blur of grey, its outline softening and then disappearing into a shape that seemed to be a small, stationary mountain, even though it was spinning fast enough to throw water outward in tiny droplets that sparkled for a fraction of a second before vanishing into the air. The speed was not yet at its fullest, but it was enough to begin the centering, and you lifted your wet hands and brought them toward the spinning clay, pausing for a moment with your palms just a finger's width from the surface, feeling the cool breeze of its motion against your skin, the air displaced by the turning mass. The first touch was always a moment of communication, the instant when your hands told you what the clay was doing and what it needed, and you laid the heels of both hands against the sides of the spinning cone with a pressure that was firm but not forceful, a steady, even push that asked the clay to move rather than demanded it. The clay wobbled under your touch, a side-to-side oscillation that you could feel as a rhythmic bumping against your left palm and then your right, the lump not yet centered, its mass still distributed unevenly around the axis of rotation, and the wobble transferred up through your wrists and into your forearms, a jittery sensation that told you the clay was fighting, resisting the new order you were trying to impose. You did not tighten your grip or push harder, because that would only amplify the wobble and throw the clay further from center. So instead, you relaxed your shoulders and let your hands ride the bumps, absorbing them with the soft flesh of your palms while you slowly, almost imperceptibly, increased the inward pressure, guiding the clay toward the middle by degrees, so small that the clay itself seemed to decide to move rather than to be moved. The posture for centering was a specific arrangement of the body that you settled into without thinking, your elbows braced firmly against the sides of your ribcage to create a stable triangle between your hands, your forearms, and your torso, a configuration that prevented your hands from being pushed outward by the force of the spinning clay. And your left hand, the anchor hand, was positioned with the heel pressed down against the edge of the wheel pan where the rim met the basin, so that the hand itself became a fixed fulcrum that the clay had to yield to. The right hand was the active hand, the one that applied most of the inward pressure, its heel digging into the clay while the fingers curled around the top of the mass to control its upward tendency, the clay wanting to rise into a tall peak but being guided instead to stay low and compact. Both hands worked together in a continuous flowing pressure that had no distinct start or stop. A single unbroken application of force that moved with the spinning clay and never fought against it. As the centering progressed, the wobble began to diminish, the rhythmic bumping against your hands growing softer and more regular until it was no longer a bump, but a gentle, even pressure that felt the same on all sides. A sign that the clay was finding its balance. You could sense this change not only through your hands, but also through the sound of the wheel, which had taken on a purer note, now that the unbalanced load was resolving itself. The hum smoothing out and the faint vibrations that had been running through the frame subsiding into stillness. The clay cone had by this point lost its original shape entirely and had become a low, rounded form, a dome that sat squarely in the middle of the wheelhead, its surface wet and gleaming and moving so smoothly that it seemed almost motionless, a trick of the eye that always pleased you in a quiet way, the paradox of something spinning at great speed, yet appearing perfectly still. But centering was rarely accomplished in one continuous motion, and just as you felt the clay settle into balance, a small pocket of unevenness, perhaps a slightly stiffer region of the clay body, or a tiny air bubble that had survived the wedging, made itself known as a sudden flutter that passed through the dome. A shimmy that you caught in your fingertips and that threatened to pull the clay off-center again. You did not react with any alarm, did not clutch or correct too sharply, because you had felt this countless times before, and you knew that the thing to do was to ease the pressure slightly, let the clay find its own equilibrium for a revolution or two, and then gently reapply the inward force, not fighting the wobble, but absorbing it, allowing it to spin itself out like a ripple on a pond that spreads and fades. The flutter subsided, the clay steadied itself, and you breathed out slowly, a breath that you had not realized you had been holding, and you continued the centering with renewed patience, your hands moving in the same slow, constant rhythm. Now that the clay was largely centered, you shifted the position of your hands to refine the balance further, bringing the left hand up from the wheel pan to join the right hand on the clay itself, both hands now cupping the dome, the fingers overlapping slightly and the heels pressing against the lower sides. The clay enclosed in a cage of your own making that rotated with it, but also shaped it. You pushed down with the heels of your hands, not a sharp push, but a gradual sinking, using the weight of your upper body rather than muscle to compress the clay downward into a flatter, wider shape, and the dome spread outward under the pressure, its top lowering and its base widening, until it became a thick disc that clung to the wheel head with a wet, sucking grip, the surface now a spinning plane of grey that seemed to breathe under your fingers. Then you reversed the motion, pulling the heels of your hams inward and upward, gathering the clay back into a taller cone, the walls rising smoothly and the top coming to a rounded point. And as the clay rose, you felt a subtle change in its consistency, the particles aligning more perfectly with each pass, the material becoming more homogeneous and more cooperative. You repeated this cycle several times, pressing the clay down and then drawing it up again, down and up, each cycle moving a little more easily as the clay warmed and softened and the last stubborn irregularities were worked out of its body. The process not a struggle, but a slow, meditative dance between your hands and the spinning earth, the kind of labor that left the mind free to wander or to settle on small observations like the way the light from the paper window caught the water droplets of the surf in the dome, or the way the knob jabbing against its stakes. During one of the drawing up motions, the clay developed a slight eccentricity again, a wobble that you had not anticipated, and you realized that the cone had grown too tall for its base, the top-heavy shape becoming unstable at speed, so you simply pressed it down once more, flattening it back into a low disc, and began the centering process again from that stable starting point, your patience as deep and unbothered as the winter snow outside that continued to fall in its own slow, indifferent rhythm. The second attempt went more smoothly, the clay responding with a willing softness, and soon the dome was spinning perfectly true, its surface a seamless, liquid-smooth curve that reflected the dim light of the brazier as a single, unbroken line of orange that ran from base to apex, a line that did not waver or bend at all, a sure sign that the center had been found and held. You maintained the speed of the wheel with a steady, even kicking, your right foot moving back and forth on the pedal without conscious thought, the motion having become as automatic as the rise and fall of your chest, and you let the centered clay spin for a minute or more, while you simply held your wet hands against it, feeling the absolute stillness at the core of the motion, the way the clay seemed to be resting even as it flew around, a knot of calm at the heart of the turning world. During this minute, you let your eyes drift away from the clay and toward the workshop around you, noting without really looking that the snow had stopped falling for the moment, and that a pale, watery sunlight was trying to break through the clouds, casting a faint shadow of the window frame across the earthen floor, a shadow that moved almost imperceptibly as the sun tracked across the sky, the only clock that mattered in this quiet season. After the minute had passed, you slowed the wheel by lifting your foot from the pedal and letting the flywheel coast, the hum dropping in pitch and the clay returning from a blur to a visible shape. The perfectly centered dome now standing still on the motionless wheelhead, its surface so smooth and even that it might have been made of polished stone rather than soft clay. The cone of grey material waiting quietly for the next stage of your hand's work. You dipped your fingers in the water bucket and flicked a few extra drops onto the dome to keep it from forming a skin, then sat back slightly on the seat, resting your spine against the wooden backrest, and allowed your hands to rest in your lap, the fingers still curled in the shape of the clay, the palms still tingling with the memory of the spinning pressure. The centering was complete, and the workshop was quiet, except for the soft, slow ticking of the cooling brazier and the occasional distant thump of snow sliding from the roof of a neighboring building, a sound that seemed to belong more to the winter itself than to any human activity, a sound that marked the slow, patient progress of the season across the village and the mountain pass. A season that was nowhere near its end and that had no need to hurry. You sat and breathed and listened, and after a time you reached for the next cone of clay under the damp cloth, because the day was long and the work was steady, and there were many pots still to be centered before the afternoon light began to fade. With the centered cone sitting still and perfect on the motionless wheelhead, its surface gleaming with the water you had flicked onto it, you allowed yourself a brief pause, a moment of stillness in which you simply looked at the clay and let your hands rest. The fingers still curled from the effort of centering but gradually relaxing, the slight ache in the forearms fading as the blood flowed back into the muscles. The workshop around you was quiet except for the small, steady sounds that had become the background of your days. The charcoal settling in the brazier with a soft rustle, the distant murmur of the kiln fire where the stoker was tending his long, slow preheat, and the almost inaudible creak of the roof beam above your head, a sound that came from the weight of the snow pressing down on the thatch and the timber, a weight that was constant and patient and would remain for many weeks yet. You leaned forward again, shifting your weight on the wooden seat, and placed your right foot back on the pedal, giving a first gentle kick that set the flywheel stirring, then a second that brought the speed up to a working pace, the hum filling the air once more and the clay cone beginning to spin, its surface blurring into that familiar, liquid-looking stillness that always seemed like a small miracle, the transformation of a lump of earth into something that appeared to be motionless even as it turned its speed. You dipped both hands into the throwing water, making sure they were thoroughly wet, the water cool and clean against your skin, and you brought them to the spinning clay, cupping the cone lightly at first, just feeling the shape and the balance, confirming that the center was still true after the moments of rest, and it was. The clay spinning without any wobble, without any flutter, as steady as a stone set in the hub of the universe. The next stage was the opening, the moment when the solid cone became a vessel, when the interior space was created from nothing, a hollow that would become the inside of a bowl, and this stage required a different touch from the centering, lighter and more precise, a guidance rather than a pressure. You positioned your left hand so that it cupped the side of the spinning cone, not squeezing, but simply supporting, providing a reference point for the right hand to work against. The heel of the left hand settled near the base, and the fingers curving gently around the curve. The right hand came to the top of the cone, the thumb extended, the other fingers curled loosely into the palm, and you touched the very center of the spinning top with the tip of your thumb, feeling the clay move under it, a tiny point of contact that was the beginning of everything. The thumb the ensign netting that sensing letting the clay turn and turn beneath it, the friction creating a slight warmth that you could feel through the thin layer of water. And then you began to press down, slowly, steadily, the pressure applied not by the thumb alone, but by the whole arm moving from the shoulder. a controlled descent that was as straight as you could make it, the thumb entering the clay like a slow auger, the clay parting around it with a soft, wet yielded, a sensation that was almost as modest as the thumb sank deeper. You could feel the floor of the pot beginning to form beneath it, the clay compressing between your thumb and the wheelhead, and you stopped before you touched the wood, leaving a thickness of clay that you estimated by feel, a thickness that would become the base of the bowl, strong enough to support the walls, but not so thick that it would crack in the firing or make the bowl heavy and clumsy. With the thumb still in the hole, you began to widen the opening, moving the thumb outward in a slow spiral, the clay stretching and expanding around it, the walls of what would become the bowl beginning to rise on either side of the deepening cavity. The sound of this stage was different from the sounds of wedging or centering, a soft, wet, sucking noise as the clay stretched and the water was drawn into the new surfaces, a sound that reminded you of footsteps in mud, a quiet, rhythmic squelching that kept time with the rotation of the wheel. Your left hand moved slightly, adjusting its position to support the outside of the widening form, and now both hands were working together in the way they always did, the left hand on the outside and the right hand on the inside, the clay wall passing between them like a membrane of spinning grey, thin enough to feel the pressure of each hand through the material to the other. When the opening was wide enough to accommodate a few fingers, you withdrew your thumb and brought the fingers of your right hand into the cavity, curling them slightly so that the tips pressed against the interior wall, and you began the process of pulling the walls upward, a motion that would thin the clay and raise the height and transform the shallow, wide depression into the defined shape of a T-bowl. The first pull was always the gentlest, a preliminary pass that tested the clay's willingness, and you placed the knuckle of your right index finger against the inside base, just where the wall met the floor, while the left hand's index finger positioned itself directly opposite on the outside, the two fingertips aligning through the clay, squeezing it very lightly, not to compress it thinner, but simply to gain a sense of its thickness. Slowly, steadily, you began to move both hands upward together, the fingers traveling from the base toward the rim, drawing the clay with them in a wave that rose and thinned as it went, the material flowing between your fingers like something between a solid and a liquid, a state that potters knew as plasticity and that required a precise balance of water and pressure and speed. The wall rose under your guidance, the rim of the bowl climbing upward and outward at a gentle angle, and you could feel the thickness changing as you pulled, the base remaining thicker for stability, while the middle and upper portions grew thinner, the clay spreading the force of your pull along the spiral grain that the wedging had created, a grain that gave the wall its strength, its ability to stand upright without slumping even as it became thin enough to transmit light. Your breath was slow and steady now, your whole body involved in the pull, your back straight and your shoulders relaxed, and your arms moving from the elbows in a smooth, continuous rise that seemed to happen in slow motion, though the clay was spinning all the while, and the wall rose through your fingers like a living thing, responding to your touch with almost perfect obedience. At the top of the pull, your fingers approached the rim, and you eased the pressure slightly as you reached it, letting the clay pass through and then lifting your hands away cleanly so as not to distort the edge. The rim now a soft, uneven circle that would need to be refined later, but that for now held the basic shape of the bowl. You dipped your right hand back into the water bucket, scooping up more water and letting it run down into the interior of the bowl, where it pooled in the bottom and then was flung outward by the centrifugal force, a thin spray of droplets that caught the light from the brazier and the paper window and sparkled for a brief instant before vanishing. The water kept the clay lubricated, preventing your fingers from dragging and tearing the surface, and you watched the interior glisten as the bowl spun, the surface smooth and wet and reflecting the dim workshop in a distorted curve. The first pull had raised the walls only a little, a modest increase in height, and the bowl was still thick-walled and heavy, a rough form that contained the potential of the finished piece but had not yet realized it, and so you repositioned your hands and prepared for a second pull, the fingers finding their places again on the inside and outside, low down near the base, the knuckle of the right hand pressing gently outward, while the left hand pressing gently outward, while the left hand's fingers provided the counter-pressure that prevented the wall from setting and rising underwood. The second pull began with the same slow, steady upward motion, the fingers traveling together in perfect synchrony, and now the clay was more responsive because it had already been stretched once and its particles had realigned, making the material more plastic and more willing to flow. The wall rose higher this time, the rim climbing to a level that was almost the final height of the bowl, and the thinning was more pronounced. The clay between your fingers growing slender and even, its surface becoming smoother with each passing revolution, the tiny irregularities and throwing lines being compressed into a uniform surface by the gentle, constant pressure of your fingertips. You pause at the top of the second pull, holding the rim for a moment, letting the clay spin through your finishers, your thumb and forefinger to compress the rim slightly, rounding it and evening it, removing the small irregularities left by the pulling, the rim becoming a smooth, continuous curve that ran around the top of the bowl without any dips or bumps. A clean line that would feel pleasant against the lips of whoever eventually drank from this vessel, though that person was, and it had after the second pull, you judged the thickness and the height by feel, running your fingers lightly down the outside of the bowl from rim to base, feeling the subtle change in thickness, the gradual thickening toward the bottom that gave the bowl its balance and its stability, and you decided that a third pull was needed, a final, light pull that would refine the shape and bring the walls to their ideal thinness. A thinness that was strong enough to survive the trimming and the drying and the biscuit. The third pull was the lightest of all, a mere suggestion of pressure, the fingers barely touching the clay, sliding upward in a motion that was more a caress than a manipulation. And the wall responded by thinning just a fraction more, the surface becoming glossy under the friction of the water and your skin, and the bowl reached its final, almost complete form, a shape that was simple and elegant, with a gently curving side and a slightly flared rim and a foot that was not yet defined because the bowl was still attached to the wheel by its solid bite. You lifted your hands away slowly, making sure not to catch the rim or distort the wall, and you let the bowl spin for another moment while you sat back slightly and looked at it, the shape of it, the way the curve rose from the wheel head and opened outward, its proportions pleasing to the eye because they were the proportions that came naturally from the material and the process rather than from any imposed design, the clay having found its own form under the guidance of your hands. The bowl was still very wet, its surface glistening with a layer of water and very fine slip, the tiniest particles of clay that had dissolved in the throwing water and now coated the surface like a thin skin. And soon you would clean this away with a sponge and refine the shape further. But for now the throwing was essentially complete, the bowl existing where before there had been only a lump of wedged clay, a transformation that you had witnessed and performed countless times, and that never lost its quiet, ordinary wonder. You slowed the wheel by lifting your foot from the pedal and letting the flywheel coast down, the pitch of the hum dropping blur to a visible object, and when the wheel had nearly stopped, you reached for the needle tool that lay on the shelf beside you, a long, thin sliver of bamboo with a sharp point, and you held it carefully between your fingers, waiting until the wheel head was turning very slowly, barely moving, and then you touched the needle point to the base of the bowl, just above where the clay met the wood, Then you put the needle tool aside and took up the wire cutter, the same wire you used for cutting wedges of clay, but used here with a different technique, holding it taut between your hands and sliding it under the bowl from the front, pulling it toward yourself in a smooth, level pass that separated the clay from the wood, the wire passing through the base with a faint, wet hiss, and the bowl was free, sitting loose on the wheel head like a small boat that had come unmoored from its dock. With both hands you lifted the bowl carefully, your fingers supporting it from below, because the clay was still soft and could be easily distorted by a grip that was too firm, and you carried it the few steps to the shelf where a wooden bat waited, a flat board of cedar that had been lightly dusted with dry clay to prevent sticking, and you set the bowl down gently, adjusting its position so that it sat upright and level, the rim horizontal, the curve of the wall undisturbed, and there it would remain for the next day or two, until the twere out of the stead that you dipped your fingers in a small bowl of water and smoothed over the score line left by the needle tool, erasing it with a circular rubbing motion that blended the base into the curve of the wall, and then you took a damp sponge and lightly cleaned the rim, removing any tiny crumbs or irregularities, the sponge leaving the rim smooth and even and perfectly circular to the eye. The Cheverziquine, big fire and simple again. The pulling, each movement a repetition of what a combat a con for thousand advance, because the clay was never exactly the same, and your hands were never exactly the same, and the moment was never the same, toward each quays were of the same, but the live riverboard was constant, the world king child with a shelf in the most paltev felt spelled the betray cake of dight. The bowls had sat on their wooden beds for 2 days now, and the workshop air, warmed by the brazier and dried by the same heat that kept the cold at bay, had slowly drawn the moisture from the clay, until each piece had reached the state that potters call leather hard, a condition in which the clay is no longer soft or easily deformed but still holds enough water to be carved and scraped without cracking or producing dust. You could tell the moment had arrived by touching the surface with a dry fingertip, feeling the cool, firm resistance, the way the clay no longer yielded to pressure but instead pushed back with a slight springiness, like pressing on a block of hard cheese, and by the colour, which had shifted from the dark, wet grey of freshly thrown work to a paler, more uniform tone, something closer to the colour of a winter cloud, the kind that hung low over the mountain, promised more snow, but had not yet delivered it. The morning of the trimming day began in the same way all the winter mornings began, with the walk through the deep cold from the house to the workshop, the snow crunching under your wooden sandals, the village quiet except for the thin columns of smoke rising from the chimneys, the sky a pale, even grey that was neither bright nor dark and seemed to hold the light in suspension, a diffuse glow that cast no shadows and gave everything a soft, flat appearance. You had eaten your rice and miso, had stoked the brazier, had checked the damp cloths on the remaining clay cones and found them still moist, and now you stood before the shelf of leather-hard bowls, running your eyes over each one, deciding the order in which you would trim them, though the order did not matter in any real sense, and was more a habit of beginning than a plan. The first bowl you chose was the one you had thrown earliest among this batch, the one whose rim had settled into a perfect circle during the drying and whose surface showed no cracks or warping, a bowl that had dried evenly because you had turned it once on the shelf the previous day, rotating it so that the side facing the brazier did not dry faster than the side facing the wall, a small act of attention that was now repaid in the soundness of the piece. You lifted it from the bat, feeling its weight in your hands, a weight that was lighter than when it was wet but still substantial, and you carried it to the wheel, setting it upside down on the wheel head, the rim resting against the wood and the foot facing upward, a position that exposed the base to your tools and allowed you to shape the exterior curve that would become the finished profile of the bowl. Before the bowl could be trimmed, it had to be secured, because the wheel would be turning and the bowl, being light and hollow, would fly off if it were not held in place, and the method for this was a simple one that used no clamps or fasteners, only the stickiness of soft clay. You took 3 small lumps of wet clay from the bucket near the wheel, clay that was much softer than the leather-hard bowl, almost sloppy in its wetness, and you rolled each one between your palms into a short, thick coil, then pressed them onto the wheel head at equal distances around the upside-down bowl, pushing them firmly against the rim so that they made contact with its edge and with the wood at the bowl steady when the wheels spun. The wet clay clung to the wood and to the bowl rim with its natural adhesion, and you checked each one with a gentle push, making sure the bowl would not shift, and it would not, the 3 coils acting like the roots of a tree, spreading the hold evenly around the circumference. With the bowl secured, you took your seat at the wheel and set your foot to the pedal, but the speed you used for trimming was much slower than the speed for throwing, a gentle, almost lazy rotation that allowed the tool to cut cleanly without skipping or chattering, a speed that produced a low, soft hum from the flywheel, a sound that was more felt than heard, a vibration that came up through the seat and into your legs, a reminder that the machine was alive and turning. You reached to the tool shelf and selected a loop tool, a metal ribbon bent into a U-shape with sharpened edges, mounted in a wooden handle that was worn to the shape of a grip. The metal dark with age and stained with the grey of old clay, a tool that had trimmed thousands of bowls before this one and would trim thousands more in the years to come, long after the snow had melted from the pass and the winter was forgotten. The first cut was always a test, a light path that skimmed the surface and told you how the clay was responding, whether it was too wet, which would make it gum up on the tool, or too dry, which would make it chip and flake. But the bowl was at the perfect stage, and the loop tool bit into the surface with a clean, smooth action, peeling away a thin ribbon of clay that curled up and away from the blade like the churving from a woodworker's plane. A continuous grey spiral that broke off and fell into a soft The sound of trimming was different from any other sound in the pottery process. A crisp, scraping whisper, a shh sound that had a slight musical quality to it, the metal edge singing against the clay at a frequency that was almost too high to hear. A note that rode just at the top of the audible range and gave the trimming its particular voice. A voice that spoke of removal and refinement, of taking away what was not needed to reveal the form that had been hidden inside. You worked the loop tool down the curve of the bowl from the foot area toward the rim, your hands moving in a slow, controlled sweep, the right hand holding the tool and the left hand guiding it, the fingers of the left hand resting lightly on the spinning surface to feel the thickness. A continuous feedback loop of touch that allowed you to adjust the pressure and angle of the cut by tiny increments, removing a little more clay where the wall was too thick and a little less where it was already thin enough. The tool followed the profile of the bowl, and as the clay was shaved away, the external shape began to emerge more clearly. The gentle swelling curve that rose from the base and then turned outward toward the rim, a curve that was the same as the one you had thrown, but now more refined, more deliberate, the surface becoming smooth and even, free of the small throwing ridges that had been left by your fingers. Those subtle horizontal lines that were the record of the pulling process, and reprocess, and with a trimming tool, it was haste with its pay that it is quite has you case for 10 minutes and right. You paused after several passes and let the wit slow, then stopped it entirely, and you leaned forward to senses to feel its smoothness, checking the thickness by pressing gently on the wall. Your senses calibrated by years of practice to detect differences of a fingernail's width. And you found a small area near the base where the wall was slightly thicker than the rest. A subtle bulge that the eye could not see, but the fingers call. The next stage of the trimming was the shaping of the foot, the ring of play at the base of the bowl that would lift it slightly from the surface on which it rested, a detail that served both a practical purpose, preventing the bowl from wobbling on an uneven table, and an aesthetic one, giving the bowl a sense of lightness and a visual lift, a separation from the ground that completed the form. You changed tools for this, setting down the loop tool and taking up a smaller trimming tool with a pointed tip and a flat edge, a tool designed for finer work, and you began to carve the foot ring, pressing the point into the clay at the center of the base and working outward in a slow spiral, cutting a shallow circular channel that defined the inner edge of the ring, the clay curling up in tiny, delicate shavings that were lighter and fluffier than the previous ribbons, almost like dry snow. The tool moved in a tight, controlled path, your hands braced firmly against each other for stability, and the foot ring emerged gradually from the clay, a neat, raised circle about the thickness of a chopstick, its top surface flat and level, its edges crisp. The whole ring centered precisely on the axis of the bowl, so that when the bowl was turned upright again, it would sit perfectly level and would not rock or tilt. Around the foot ring, you trimmed away the remaining clay of the base, lowering the area between the ring and the outer edge so that the ring stood up proud, and you shaped the transition from the ring to the wall of the bowl, a gentle curve that swept upward and outward, the kind of curve that you could feel but not quite see, a curve that was known to the hand more than to the eye, a detail that might never be consciously noticed by the person who used the bowl, but that would contribute to the overall feeling of rightness, the sense that the object walk that would weld the one miquid fall. The trimming of the foot took more time than the trimming of the wall because it required more precision, and you worked slowly, pausing often to check the depth and the angle, brushing away the loose shavings with a soft brush made of horsehair, the bristles light and springy and very gentle against the clay. When the foot was finished to your satisfaction, you took a small metal rib, a rectangle of thin, flexible steel with rounded corners, and you burnished the trimmed surfaces, holding the rib flat against the spinning bowl and applying a light, even pressure, the metal sliding over the clay with a faint, high-pitched squeak, a sound that was the only sound in the workshop now except for the crackle of the brazier and the low hum of the wheel. The burnishing compressed the surface particles and closed any tiny pores left by the trimming tool, making the surface smoother and slightly denser, a finish that would affect how the glaze adhered and how the final piece felt in the hand. And you worked the rib over every part of the trimmed area, from the footring to the curve of the wall, the surface becoming ever so slightly glossy under the friction, a soft sheen that would disappear when the bowl was fully dry, but that would return, transformed in the glaze firing. When the trimming and burnishing were complete, you stopped the wheel and brushed the bowl clean with the horsehair brush. Brush swimming of clay from the surface and from the inside of the footring, the little shavings falling into the wheel pan where they joined the growing pile of trimmings from this and previous sessions, a pile that was dry and crumbly and light, its color several shades paler than the wet clay from which it had come, the color of dust or of the very fine snow, to snow dry and find the cold. You lifted the bowl from the wheelhead, carefully breaking the soft clay coils that held it in place, the wet clay peeling away from the leather-hard surface without leaving any marks, and you set the bowl upright on a clean wooden bat, its footring now resting on the wood, the bowl standing in its finished profile, a shape that was complete in its essentials, needing only the stamp of the maker's mark and the application of glaze to be ready for the kiln. You turned the bowl slowly in your hands, examining it from every angle, the curve, the rim, the foot, the thin, even wall that you could sense more than see, and you found it good, not perfect in any absolute way, but good in the way that handmade things are good, bearing the subtle marks of the process, the slight irregularity that spoke of a human rhythm rather than a mechanical one. The bowl went onto the shelf with the other trimmed pieces, and you swept the wheel pan clean, gathering the trimmings in your hands and dropping them into the scrap bucket, where they would dry completely, and then be ground into powder and mixed with water to make slip for the next round of pots. Because nothing was wasted, nothing was thrown away, and the clay that had been removed from this bowl would one day become part of another bowl, a different form, but the same material, circulating through the workshop in a slow, patient cycle that had no bell. The wheel pan was clean now, the wood dark and smooth, and you took a cloth and wiped it down, removing the last traces of moisture, preparing the wheel for the next bowl that waited on the shelf, still upside down, still held in place by 3 wet coils of clay, still ready to be transformed by the slow work of trimming, a work that would occupy your hands for the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, while outside the snow clouds gathered low over the mountain pass and the village settled deeper into its winter quiet. The trimmed bowls had been standing on their bats for another day and a half, and their surfaces had changed again, fading from the pale cloud grey of the leather-hard state to an even lighter tone that was almost white, the color of dried clay that had given up nearly all of its moisture to the warm moving air of the workshop, the same air that circulated gently from the brazier to the warm moving air of the workshop, the same air that circulated gently from the brazier to the door, and back again, carrying the faint smell of the truck or try lift. The bowls were now in the state potters call bone dry, a term that described not only their color, which was indeed close to the color of old bone, but also their fragility and their readiness to absorb liquid, the clay being at its most porous and most delicate before the fire transformed it into something harder and more permanent. You had come into the workshop earlier than usual on this particular morning, the sky still dark and the snow still falling in a thin, steady drift that was more a presence than an event. The flakes so fine and sparse that they seemed to hang in the air rather than fall, each one a tiny point of white that moved slowly and without urgency, adding another whisper of thickness to the deep banks that had long since buried the garden stones and the lower branches of the pines. The brazier was burning well, its charcoal bright and steady, and the workshop had already begun to warm, the heat rising into the rafters, where the drying lines hung with cloths and aprons that had stiffened in the night cold and were now softening as the temperature rose, letting off a faint steam that was invisible but could be felt as a slight dampness in the air near the ceiling. Today was the day for slips and glazes, for the application of the liquid coatings that would give the bowls their color and their surface, their protection from water and their visual identity, the thin layers of suspended minerals that would melt and flow and fuse in the kiln, transforming into glassy skins that could be clear or opaque, glossy or matte, bright or subdued, depending on the composition and the firing and the place in the kiln where each pot rested. You had already prepared most of the materials days earlier, but the glazes needed to be stirred and adjusted, the slips needed to be checked for thickness, and your hands needed to be clean and dry and patient for the careful work of dipping and pouring and brushing that would occupy the morning. The first thing you did was to take down the bucket of ash glaze from its shelf near the back wall. A wooden bucket with a tight-fitting lid that had been sealed with a strip of damp cloth to prevent the contents from drying out, and you set it on the low work table beside the wheel. The bucket heavy and solid, its staves dark with old moisture, its iron bands rusted to a deep brown that was almost black. The whole thing a vessel that had served the workshop for longer than anyone could remember, and that would serve for many years more. You lifted the lid and looked inside, and the glaze stared back at you as a smooth, greyish liquid, the colour of river water in winter when the silt is suspended and the light is low. A colour that was not quite grey and not quite brown, but something in between. Something that had no name except the name of the glaze itself. A skin had formed on the surface, a thin, rubbery layer of partially dried glaze, and you pinched it between your fingers and lifted it away in one piece. A translucent sheet that you dropped into the scrap bucket, and the liquid beneath was fresh and ready. The ash glaze was made from the ashes of rice straw and pine wood that had been burned in the kiln fireboxes throughout the autumn. The ashes collected and washed and sieved and washed again until they were pure and fine. A soft grey powder that felt like talc between the fingers and that contained the silica and alumina and flux materials that would melt into glass in the heat of the kiln. The exact same materials that would melt into glass in the heat of the kiln. The exact same materials that the plants and that the flout redded into bask and that the fight and that the plat You stirred the glaze with a wooden paddle, a long, flat stick that reached to the bottom of the bucket, and you stirred slowly and steadily, working the paddle around in a circular motion that lifted the settled solids from the bottom and mixed them evenly into the liquid, the sound a soft, wet, sloshing rhythm. The glaze swirling in the bucket and lightening in colour as the particles distributed themselves, becoming a uniform, creamy fluid that coated the paddle in a smooth grey film. After the glaze was stirred, you checked its thickness by dipping a dry finger into it and pulling it out, watching the way the liquid sheeted off your skin, the speed at which it ran, and the way it left a thin, even coating behind. A coating that did not crack or crawl as it dried, which told you that the consistency was right, not too thick, which would cause the glaze to crack and flake off in the kiln, and not too thin, which would produce a pale, watery surface that did not cover the clay body properly. Satisfied, you set the bucket aside and turned to the slip. The white liquid clay that would be brushed onto some of the bowls to brighten their interiors and to give them a lighter surface. A surface that would contrast pleasingly with the darker ash glaze and that would show the brushstrokes as a subtle texture. A record of the hand that had applied it. The slip was kept in a smaller bucket, a ceramic jar with a narrow mouth that reduced evaporation, and it was made from a white-firing clay that had been dug from a different part of the hillside, a clay that was leaner and paler than the grey body clay, its colour when mixed with water, a clean, bright cream that reminded you of the froth on a warm cup of milk, a colour that was soft and reassuring and that would become even whiter in the kiln, firing to a smooth, slightly glossy white that would tea in the water and the tart at the tatami. You stirred the slip with a clean paddle, not the same one you had used for the glaze, because the two materials had to be kept separate, each one pure and uncontaminated. The slick paddle lighter in weight and narrower, suitable for the thinner consistency of the slip, and you stirred until the resistance was even from top to bottom, the paddle moving smoothly through the liquid, like a chopstick through thin honey. With the glazes and slips prepared, you cleared a space on the work table and laid out the tools you would need for the decorating. A soft brush with bristles made from deer hair, a pair of dipping tongs that were simply two flexible strips of bamboo lashed together at one end, a few clean cloths for wiping drips, and the small iron stamp that bore the mark of your workshop. A simple design of a mountain and a stream, or perhaps it was a cloud and line of rain. The design, so misapplied by generations of use that it could reads. The stamp was dark with age, its iron surface rusted to a deep brown, its characters or symbols worn smooth but still legible, and you set it on a folded cloth so that it would not roll or be knocked to the floor. Then you began to bring the bowls to the table, one by one, carrying each bone-dry piece with the extra care that was required at this stage, because the clay was now at its most fragile, so brittle that a slight tap against the edge of a shelf or against another bowl would crack it or chip it or shatter it entirely. And you had to hold each piece as if it were already a finished treasure, your fingers light and deliberate, the bowls cradled in your palms like sleeping birds. You arranged them on the table in rows. The first batch that would receive the white slip, the second batch that would be dipped in the ash glaze without slip, and the third, smaller batch that would be left unglazed on the outside, but glazed within. Experimental pieces that were part of the ongoing conversation between the potter and the clay, a conversation that never ended and that produced occasional surprises. The slip application came first, and you took up the deer-hair brush, its handle smooth and rounded, its bristles soft and full, and you dipped it into the slip jar, letting the liquid soak into the bristles. Then you lifted it out and wiped the excess against the rim. A single smooth stroke that left the brush loaded, but not dripping, the bristles coming to a fine point that was perfect for the kind of loose, flowing decoration that you intended. The first bowl sat before you on a small pad of cloth that kept it from rolling, and you began to brush the slip onto its interior, starting at the center of the floor and working outward in a spiral, the brush strokes overlapping slightly, the slit flowing onto the clay in a thin, even coat that darkened the surface as it went, the color shifting from dry bone to wet cream, a change that happened almost instantly, and that was pleasant to watch. The way the liquid wet the thirsty clay and sank into its pores, carrying the fine white ults to the holotrelist to the each brushstroke made a soft, faint sound, a whisper of bristles dragging over the porous surface, a sound that was barely audible but that you could feel through the handle of the brush, a delicate, frictioned vibration that told you the slip was flowing correctly and the clay was absorbing it evenly, not too fast, which would leave brush marks too prominent, and not too slowly, which would mean the slip was too thick and would crack as it dried. You worked your way outward from the center to the rim, leaving just the very edge bare so that the natural color of the clay would show there and create a subtle line, a transition between the white interior and the ash-glazed exterior. And when the interior was fully coated, you examined it in the lamplight, tilting the bowl to catch the gloss of the wet slip, looking for any bare spots or runs or drips that would need to be smoothed out. And finding none, you set the bowl aside and took up the next one, repeating the process with the same glaze. The brushing of slip took much of the morning because you did not rush, and because each bowl was slightly different in its curve and its surface, requiring subtle adjustments of the brush angle and pressure, and because the slip itself began to thicken slightly in the jar as the water evaporated into the warm air, requiring you to add a few drops of water from a small cup and stir it again with a bamboo splinter, restoring its proper consistency, the slip swirling and thinning and becoming just once more. The bowls that had been slipped were now arranged on a separate shelf to dry, their interiors a soft chalky white that was already beginning to lose its wet gloss and take on the matte surface of dry slip, a surface that you could not yet touch because the slip, though dry to the eye, was still fragile and powdery and could be smudged by the lightest contact, and would have to wait until after the bisque firing before it was durable enough to handle freely. With the slipping done, you turned to the glazing, and now the rhythm changed, became more physical, involving the whole body in the lifting and dipping and turning. The large bucket of ash glaze positioned on the floor between your feet, the dipping tongs in your right hand and the waiting piles of bone-dry bowls on the table to your left. The dipping tongs were a simple tool but required a specific skill to use, gripping the bowl by the rim or the foot with just enough pressure to hold it securely, but not so much that the fragile clay would crack, a balance that you had learned long ago and that your hands remembered without being told. You took a bowl that had not been slipped, one that would be entirely coated in the ash glaze, inside and out, and you held it with the tongs, gripping it gently around the foot, and then you lowered it into the glaze bucket, submerging it completely in one smooth, steady motion, the glaze flowing over the bowl and filling its interior and covering its exterior, the grey liquid closing over the foot ring and then opening again as you lifted the bowl out, the glaze sheeting off the surface in a smooth, even curtain. The tenants derutted the gatlinet. The action of dipping was repeated for each bowl, and between dips you stirred the glaze again with the paddle, keeping the solids in suspension, because the heavier particles settled quickly, and if the glaze was not stirred often, the first bowls would receive too thinner coating, and the last bowls would receive too thinner coating, and the last bowls would receive too thicker coating, an inconsistency that would show in the firing, and that was easily prevented by the simple act of stirring. The klizig, the klisk, to the hint vent kind of streak against navigability, matte surface that was the color of a dove's wing, or of a winter sky at the moment and the Cairo to be's wing, or of a winter sky at the moment before the trime, but Lord, red, grey, brown, bullock fell stunting that it seemed an interfolded of absorbed light, right, rather than the light that the blake lake, but kite brat, stipperate, grey back, after the glazed bowls had dried enough to handle, which took about the time needed to drink a cup of tea and to check the brazier, and to stand for a while looking out the doorway at the snow that was still falling, still fine and slow and endless. You brought them back to the table for the final step of the morning's work, the stamping of the maker's mark. The node, this attitude one, not too hard because the bone-dry clay would crack if you pushed too deep, but firmly enough that the design would be legible after the firing, and you rocked the stamp slightly to be cleanly, weaving behind a small round indentation the peel the mode. That a deceive mind and mont indensated. The morning of the kiln loading began with a stillness that was different from the stillness of other mornings, a waiting quality in the air that even the snow seemed to feel, the flakes falling more slowly and more sparsely than they had in days, as if the whole valley were holding its breath in anticipation of the fire that would soon be lit. You had risen early and eaten your rice in silence, the warmth of the hearth a small comfort against the cold that pressed against the walls, and you had dressed with extra care today because the loading would be a long task, requiring steady hands and a calm mind. The kind of work that could not be hurried and could not be done twice, each pot placed in the kiln only once before the door was sealed, and the flames began their slow, transforming work. The glazed bowls and cups and the few small water jars had been drying on their racks for 2 full days now, and their surfaces had turned from the wet, glossy grey of the freshly dipped glaze to the soft, matte, powdery surface of the raw glaze coat. A surface that was as fragile as frost on a winter leaf, and that had to be handled with the same gentle touch, the lightest brush of a fingertip, enough to be handled with the same gentle touch. The lightest brush of a fingertip, enough to smudge the mineral layer and leave a mark that would show in the firing. You had checked each piece in the morning, turning it slowly in the pale light from the paper window, looking for any cracks that might have appeared during the drying, any drips or runs or thin patches that would need to be corrected, and you had found only a few small drips on one bowl, which you had carefully scraped away with a bamboo knife and then smoothed with a dry finger, the powder of the glaze falling away softly and the surface beneath restored to an even coat. The assistant was already waiting for you at the workshop door when you arrived. A quiet young man who had been with the workshop for several seasons and who knew the work well enough that words were rarely needed between you, a nod or a gesture, or simply a shared understanding of what came next being sufficient to coordinate the slow, careful labour ahead. He was dressed for the cold in padded winter clothes, his hands wrapped in cloth strips to keep them warm and to provide a soft grip for the pots, and he had already swept the path from the workshop to the kiln shed, clearing the fresh snow that had fallen during the night and leaving a clean, dark trail of packed snow that would make the carrying easier, the footing safer for the precious load. The two of you began the work by carrying the pots from the drying racks to a low table near the workshop door, where you arranged them in the order they would travel to the kiln, the larger pieces first, the tea bowls next, and the smallest cups last, each one examined once more and then wrapped lightly in a strip of soft cotton cloth to protect it during the short journey through the cold air. The cloth was clean and dry, and it covered each pot loosely, not tied or fastened, simply draped over the form like a winter cloak, and when all the pots were gathered and wrapped, the table was a landscape of soft white mounds. The shapes of the bowls and cups suggested beneath the fabric, but not fully visible, a quiet assembly of hidden things waiting to be revealed. The walk to the kiln shed was only 50 paces, but those 50 paces felt longer today, because each step had to be taken with care, the snow packed and slippery in places, the cloth-wrapped pots, balanced in both hands, held close to the chest for warmth and stability, the breath rising in thin clouds that would quickly torn apart by the slight breeze that came down from the pass. A breeze that carried the clean, sharp smell of snow and pine and the faintest hint of wood smoke It would pass the low glare. The assistant walked ahead of you, carrying 2 pots at a time, his steps careful and deliberate, his body moving with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had done this many times and who would do it many times more. And the track of his footprints in the snow was a dotted line that you followed without looking, your eyes on the cloth in your hands, your mind on the weight and the balance and the need for stillness. The kiln shared within the sentence. A dances that nothing wept which mind itself rose from the earth like a sleeping dragon, a long segmented mound of clay and brick that climbed the slope in a series of steps, each step a separate chamber, with its own arching roof and its own small doorway, the whole structure perhaps 20 paces in length and half that in width surface. Draft, it bracken from a belt first mobile belting belts the door of the first chamber stood open, a low, arching opening just tall enough to stoop through, and beyond it the interior of the kiln was dark and cool, the air still and heavy with the smell of old ash and fired earth, a smell that was not unpleasant, but was very old, the accumulated scent of countless firings that had baked the clay of the walls to a hard, ringing surface and had coated the floor in a deep layer of grey ash that was soft under feet, into faint clouds when you moved. The ash so atanatic You stooped and entered the chamber first, your breath catching slightly at the change in temperature, the interior being cooler than the outside air, the earth of the hillside keeping a constant chill that no amount of winter firing could fully warm, and your eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, the only light coming from the open doorway behind you and from a small oil lamp that hung from a hook in the arched ceiling, its flame steady and yellow and small, casting long, moving shadows that danced over the walls and made the space feel larger than it was. The chamber was about the size of a small room, its floor hard-packed ash, its walls curving upward to form the vaulted ceiling where the hot gases would swirl and mix and descend onto the pots below, and the shelves were already in place, flat slabs of refractory clay that rested on short pillars of brick, forming a series of horizontal platforms that rose step by step toward the back of the chamber, each shelf spaced just far enough to accommodate the height of the tea bowls and the small jars that would occupy them. The assistant brought the first load of pots to the doorway and passed a nave and tifa into the chamber, placing them on a temporary shelf near the entrance, where they would wait while you prepared the waddings and the setting sand, the small cushions of clay and sand that would support each pot and prevent it from sticking to the shelf or to its neighbours being a liquid that would melt and flow in feeplaten crusden at the cold and flow at a crack or a piece, when it would depolted to perfectly the brilded for pelty to get a lack of splatter different its eative combined so negative fake. To my the pulse of its repeated the poth reef. Evil bed at about the size of a grain of rice, so it bolts suppulsible with that it treat bold the gets at the pay fiticit to get bubble it into bibar the citis of a. You began to place the pots, starting with the largest pieces at the back of the chamber, where the heat would be most intense and most even, the water jars and the larger bowls that needed the highest temperatures to mature their glazes and vitrify their bodies, and each pot was lifted from its cloth wrapping with both hands and carried slowly to its designated spot, where it was lowered gently onto the waiting waddings. Press down with the light, even pressure until you felt the 3 pellets flatten slightly, and take the weight, the pot sitting firm, sit remd steads health. The sound of each placement was a soft, dry, ceramic click. The sound of the unglazed foot ring contacting the waddings, a sound that was small and precise and that echoed slightly in the enclosed space, a single isolated note that marked the completion of one pot's journey from the wheel to the kiln and the beginning of its final transformation. The assistant moved back and forth between the workshop and the kiln shed, carrying the racked pots with patient steps, his face calm and his breathing even, and he handed each piece through the low doorway with a gentle care that matched your own, the pots passing from his cloth-covered hands to your cloth-covered hands without a word, only the slight nod or the brief meeting of eyes to confirm that the transfer was complete, that the pot was secure, that the rhythm could continue. You worked your way from the back of the chamber toward the front, filling the shelves one row at a time. The tea bowls arranged in their neat rows like a miniature village of clay houses, their rounded forms clustered together but not touching, the gaps between them measured by eye and by the width of a finger. Just enough space for the flame to pass and wrap around each piece, the hot gases flowing through the narrow channels and bathing every surface in their even surface. Mensid. Checked the flow but the narrow passages. At the debates behind was up. The small cups were placed last, near the front of the chamber, with the cased walls that were thin and delicate, and glaze that could become too fluid if the temperature rose too high, the glass flowing downward and pooling at the base and closing the interior, a risk that was managed by the experienced placement of each piece in its correct zone. The front the coolest firing, the back for the hottest of the pedanist, but its piece in its correct zone. The front the coolest firing, the Bedtime pitlet had the bowel data top flady gold hat burn. The loading took all of the morning and much of the early afternoon, the hours passing slowly and quietly, the only sounds being the soft footsteps on the snowy path, the rustle of cloth wrappings, the dry click of pots being set down, and the occasional distant call of a crow from the dark pines at the edge of the village, a sound that seemed to belong to the winter itself, and that served only to deepen the silence when it faded. You stopped once to eat a small rice ball that had been wrapped in a leaf and kept warm in your pocket, and you drank a cup of cold water from the jar near the kiln door, the water sharp and clean and tasting slightly of the charcoal through which it had been filtered. And then you returned to the work, your hands steady and your back slightly sore from the stooping and the reaching, but your mind calm and focused, the rhythm of the loading having become a kind of meditation, a slow repetitive ritual that left no room for wandering thoughts. When the last small cup was placed at the front of the chamber, you stood back and surveyed the arrangement. The rows of glazed pots with their pale powdery surfaces, the way the light from the oil lamp fell on their curves and cast soft shadows on the shells. The stillness of the air that was soon to be broken by the roar of the fire, the whole chamber now filled with the quiet presence of the waiting vessels, each one a container of potential utensils, each one a container of titanium, its glazed skill wrought can be housed in it. The assistant had brought the fire bricks and the clay mortar to the kiln door, and now the two of you began the final task of the loading day, the sealing of the doorway, the closing of the chamber that would not be opened again until the firing was done and the kiln had cooled. A period of many days and nights during which the pots would be invisible and untouchable, suspended in the dark heat while the fire did its work. The fire bricks were heavy and rough, their surfaces pitted with old mortar and blackened by many firings, and you placed them one by one across the arch of the doorway, starting from the bottom and working upward, each brick set into a bed of wet clay mortar that sealed the gaps and made the wall airtight. The mortar mixed to a thick paste in a wooden bucket, its color a deep, reddish-brown, its texture gritty under the fingers, its smell of clay returning to its original state before being transferred. The assistant handed you the bricks and you set them in place, tapping each one gently with a wooden mallet to settle it into the mortar. The sound a dull, hollow thud that was very different from the dry click of the pots, a sound of closure and finality, and the wall rose slowly, course by course, the opening shrinking until only a small square remained at the top, just large enough for the peephole, the spy hole through which you would watch the flames and judge the temperature and the atmosphere and the progress of the firing. The only window in the world was big, coming side that around this opening you carefully left a gap the size of 2 fists, and you did not brick it over because it would serve as the spy hole and as a small safety vent for the expanding gases until the firing was fully underway and the hole was reduced to a narrow slit through which you would peer again and again in the long hours ahead. When the wall was complete, you and the assistant stood for a moment in the quiet of the kiln shed, looking at the sealed doorway, the dark bricks and the pale mortar and the small dark opening at the top that seemed to peer back at you like a single eye, patient and watchful and hungry for the fire that was to come. The work was done, the pots were in their places, the chamber was closed and ready, and there was nothing more to do until dusk, when the firing would begin. The slow introduction of the flames into the firebox, the gradual rise of the temperature, the long, careful process of bringing the kiln to life that would occupy the next several days and nights, and that would demand all of your attention and patience and skill. The assistant the looking discoming it can't buy him to the bed, standing in the quiet side in the word that the trace to in make it in this the seal the slain and twibbers totable them hold the mice set to the quite went in the domain and in the fight in my end. The fight at the Mikati glad with a fire but I'm white to mind my dixbekat the could be from Abaka came out the barber tried to the bit into the set of our back. The afternoon had passed in a quiet preparation, that was not so different from the preparation of the clay or the trimming of the leather-hard pots. A slow gathering and arranging of the things you would need for the long night ahead. The firewood stacked under the shelter of the kiln shed, the kindling basket filled with dry cedar bark and pine splints, the iron poker and the long-handled shovel set beside the stokehole, and a wooden bucket of water placed at a safe distance from the firebox in case the flames should be calmed, though the flames did indeed calmed. Though the charcoal brazier from the workshop had been brought to the kiln shed and set near the wooden bench where you would rest between stokings, its glow a small, companionable warmth in the gathering dusk, and a thick padded blanket was folded on the bench, waiting to be wrapped around your shoulders when the night cold deepened, and the fire's warmth could not quite reach the place where you sat. As the light began to fail beyond the paper windows of the workshop and the snow-covered village, you walked the short path to the kiln shed once more, your wooden sandals leaving fresh prints in the thin layer of new snow that had fallen during the afternoon, a layer so fine and dry that it squeaked underfoot with a soft, powdery sound, the sound of winter itself, the sound of a world frozen still and waiting. The sky had cleared in the east, and a few early stars were already visible, cold and sharp and very far away, while in the west a band of deep amber and pale green marked the last of the sun's light disappearing behind the mountain ridge, the same mountain ridge that held the pass that was still buried under snow and would be for many weeks, sealing the village in its pocket of silence and darkness and fire. At the kiln shed, the assistant had already lit the small oil lamp that hung from a post, its flame steady and yellow, and he had opened the iron door of the firebox, the square, dark mouth at the base of the kiln where the wood would be fed. The door that led into the firebox chamber and from there into the long, sloping tunnel of the kiln itself. The passage where the flames would travel upward through the chambers, over the shelves of waiting pots, around the curves of the T-bar to the east. The firebox was cold now. Its floor swept clean of ash from the preheating fire that had burned low all day, and you knelt before it and began to lay the first fire, the small, careful arrangement of kindling and split pine that would grow into the great heat of the full firing. The kindling was dry and light, and you placed it in a loose lattice across the firebox floor, leaving spaces for the air to flow, needs to breathe, needs to draw the cold air from outside and turn it into flame, and then into hot gas that would climb through the kiln and escape from the chimney at the top. A breath that you would manage through the night by adjusting the damper and the stokehole door, and the amount of wood you fed. A slow conversation between you and the fire, and a dial of wilder. The pine splints caught the flame from the oil lamp's wick with a soft, eager crackle, and the fire woke and grew, the yellow light spreading across your face and hands, the warmth pushing back the cold that had settled in the kiln shed, and you sat back on your heels and watched the flames for a while, letting them establish themselves, letting the firebox and the first section of the kiln begin to warm, the clay walls absorbing the heat, slowly, the moisture that remained from the preheating rising as a thin, invisible steam that you could smell as the baked. The first hour of the firing was always the most gentle, a time when the temperature rose by barely perceptible degrees, and the kiln seemed to be waking rather than working, its old bricks and clay shells stretching and settling, the ash from previous firings stirring in the draught and then lying still again. And he fed the fire with small sticks of pine at regular intervals, the intervals measured not by a clock, but by the look of the flames and the sound of the kiln's draw. The low, rumbling inhale that pulled the air through the darkening sky to the assistant had left soon after the fire was lit, his task for the evening being to check the village kiln's other chambers and to ensure that no embers had escaped to threaten the snow-covered roofs. And you were alone now with the fire and the cold and the quiet, the only sounds being the crackle of the burning pine and the soft roar of the kiln's breath, and the occasional distant thud of snow sliding from a roof in the village below. You settled onto the wooden bench, pulling the thick blanket over your shoulders, and you tasted the scenes then fires in the bricked-up doorway, where the flame from inside the kiln chamber was just barely visible as a shifting orange glow. A glow that was still soft and low, the color of a winter sunset, and that would change as the hours passed, the orange deepening to yellow and then to pale yellow, and then to pale yellow, to the tiled you the clade with twits chig that peat was many hours away, still hidden in the future, and for now the fire needed only to be tended with patience. Each stick of wood added at the right moment, each adjustment of the damper made with a slow, careful hand, the damper being a simple clay tile that covered or uncovered a vent in the chimney, controlling the flow of air and thus the speed and the temperature and the nature of the flame, a small grey tile that you slid back and forth with the iron poker, feeling the resistance and listen change in the change in which you can as. The hours of the night passed in this rhythm, a slow, steady cycle that was the same as the rhythm of wedging or throwing or trimming, the body and the mind working together in a state of calm attention that needed no effort to maintain. That was simply the way of things when the snow was deep and the pass was closed and the world was reduced to this single, glowing space, this small island of warmth in the vast cold of the mountain winter. You added wood, you watched the spy hole, you adjusted the damper, and then you rested on the bench, your back against the rough wooden post, your eyes half closed, your breathing slow and even, your thoughts drifting like the snowflakes that still fell from time to time, a few thin flakes spiraling down through the open front of the shed and landing on the packed snow near the firebox, where they melted instantly and were gone. The bolsende trive belicht, de bolsende proud it valuable send the berate treat. A far at them balls but a set of fetation bedigetable. And die kind of whipple but it bounced extinct slowing stide. The kind of bots noid vid send a bits not, the sight in that fire woody, the kinding in air, the ensure the fraction, the ploil, the flames shadowless time, to shibble the planes, the flames the control bite, just to did start and the fight of the ties at the fight, is the fight of the soul, the side either to the backs of the val, the tout it said, but the fight set the by, the baited the buffeted. Tonight of where as something else was as hicked heinzel to quait, had sat but had evit, hist. Of not street white did's mouth free cold bait shrapped. The firing moved into its later stages as the night wore on, the colour at the spy hole shifting from orange to a brighter yellow, the heat from the kiln now radiating through the bricked-up doorway so strongly that you could feel it on your face from several paces away, and the snow near the kiln shed had melted back, leaving a ring of bare, frozen earth that was dark and wet and that reflected the light of the fire in small shimmering puddles. The wood piles was smaller than squatedrakening, cold at the last of a long time and gave off a steady, intense heat, the kind of heat that would credging to cone to cones to coals that lasted a long time, and gave all the spanned in time to calder strumorth. A small coloured beheld pulse shriveled the smatal to sell the colour, tell that doubt of the babble to up, use a natural result of it. There was but housed errors despite of binding into what eating with us. The way quite this mation draws wine tea, we these aids, breads. The trying I were after betraying just at the fouling, it draws any wet for me to trying to fight for hate. To within plan and straight and try this taming bloody figures of bind December with the dewarming drag. The peak of the firing cane is the siven. The commoning something that to me sent as quatus fig tracks to see its highest point, and was now the camp of the kai and spurcum its wested. If the temperature from sense a calm bubble, either the ceiling the firebox and the woes rin of passes, other toll a stroll falls at the dime, of the toss to dust a dark bandrich, but beseldest to stall of the stomach the stick away at shremain and the second it. As the last log burned down to embers, and the firebox was finally closed with its iron door, you banked the remaining coals carefully, pushing them to the back of the firebox and covering them with a thin layer of ash to hold their heat through the rest of the night, and then you slid the damper nearly shut, leaving just a crack for the kiln to breathe as it cooled, the adjustments made with slow, sleepy hands that knew the work so well they did not need your mind to guide them. The roar of the kiln had faded to a low, murmuring hum, a sound that was more of a bison's, bequisted naked dark red glow, the colour of embers, the colour of the last warmth before the long cooling began, and you stepped back from the kiln and stretched your arms and your back and stood for a while, in the quiet of the shed, listening to the hum and the silence and the mingling of the two, the fire's voice and the snow's silence becoming one thing, one step. This kabsken fodgikbeks and neek so it the broad of the veget. You thrive sibble penguin stummer to come the mishtik. The bees is to the edge of the kiln shed, looking out of the village, the roofs now all dark, the windows all shuttered, the snow still falling in a thin, quiet drift, the tracks of your earlier footsteps already filled and erased, the putritimals ounced, the pars still keel their firing trig, the be celibate bargain and be killed with the pirate, as the futon tried sink things thingy did the did mit kite Jane was spread, and the twap slangen of the tridring, so let the church waking light of the player, but it said he quite turned the babach saking double tick the bullet legend